Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are. It's definitely afternoon in Moscow. I'm going to talk about the anonymous saint, and that's actually his name, Anonymous. This paper, if you want to see more details, just check the text that has been press circulated. Veneration of the anonymous saint who first appeared in Syria as the man of God, Gabriel Allah, and from the 9th century became known in Byzantium and later in the West as Saint Alexis or Alexios, the man of God, was widely spread in all Christian East, even as far as Ethiopia. Dramatic developments and transformations of his legend had been an object of scholarly interest since the 18th century. Various parts and texts comprising his dossier in the Byzantine, Slavic, European, Ethiopic, and especially in the Syriac tradition had been published and studied. First by the Bollandists in 1725 and later by Amiot, Cerulli, Massman, Van Esbroek, Paikova, Ivanov, Muravyov, and others. However, the Georgian and Armenian versions of this peculiar tradition have not so far received any particular attention, at least not that I know of, but of course there might be studies that I have overlooked or didn't come across. And I would be very grateful for your comments and suggestions. My interest in the Armenian tradition of the man of God arose from a request from my colleague Alexei Muravyov, who works on the Georgian version of the legend, to have a look at the Armenian text so that we could compare them. And also from a plea from my students, who you now see on the screen, to try and read some text that could be of any use to someone. I presented a preliminary version of this paper at a conference in Matanadaran in November 2019 and received many helpful comments from the colleagues there, especially from Armine Melkonyan, who I want to thank separately, because without her suggestions on the manuscripts containing the vita of this saint, I would not have reached any conclusions that I'm going to share with you. But I want to say that these conclusions are yet preliminary, and my paper today will be a description of a work in progress rather than a report on a finished piece of research. I have outlined the main developments of the legend in the text that has been circulated amongst the participants. So I will speak very briefly about them, because the difference between these versions is quite crucial and directly pertaining to the problem of the Armenian version. The earliest Syriac version, 5th or maybe 6th century, contains the following story. An anonymous saint leaves the house of his parents on the eve of his wedding, goes to Edessa, spends 17 years in Edessa, in a church among the poor, dies there, and then his grave is checked by the famous Bishop Rabua, who finds it empty. As a result, the bishop is so impressed by this miraculous event that he directs all his energy and all the resources to the care of the strangers. And that's the end of the first version of the story. The second Syriac version, 9th century, or maybe a bit later, has the same anonymous saint picking up from where he was left, let's say in his grave. So he does not notice his own death in Edessa, and don't ask me what that means. He goes to Rome, retreats to the house of his parents, who do not recognize him, and lives there for 17 years, abused and mistreated by the servants of the household. Before his death, he leaves a letter, a hartion, in which he reveals his identity. This hartion is then solemnly taken from the hands of the deceased saint by the emperors themselves, because these are Emperors Honorius and Arcadius, and also by the Bishop of Rome, Innocentius. Then there appears a Greek version which is probably contemporary to the Syriac one, in which the name of the saint is finally revealed. He is now Alexios. He does not die in Edessa, but flees from unwanted fame and ends up in Rome. So then the story goes like in the second Syriac version, with an addition that his bride provides the wedding ring, produces the wedding ring and the belt buckle described in the Hartion, and that's how everyone knows that he is exactly the same person. The liturgical commemoration of Saint Alexios, the man of God, is witnessed in the Typicon of the Great Church, 10th, 11th century, in the verse prologos of Christopher of Mytilene, and in the Studite Typicon of the 11th century, so it's quite early. But nobody has yet looked for any hints in his honor in the languages of the Christian East, outside of the Byzantine tradition. And I think if they were found, they might provide new evidence for this cult and might solve some riddles, the main of which are the mystery of his name and the development of this tradition between the 6th and the 9th century. And this is where we come to the mysteries associated with the Armenian version of this saint's life. The legend of the man of God does not appear in the early Synaxaria, but it appears in some collections of the lives of saints, like Matanadaran 792, in the homiliaries and in the later versions of the Synaxarium. The full text of the saint's life was published by the Mehiterists in 1855 in their collection of the lives of the Holy Fathers. It is a very long text, much longer than the Syriac versions 1 and 2, and longer than the metaphrastic Greek version. The Mehiterists' edition was based on a number of unspecified manuscripts, that's the problem with their editions, which makes tracing the original text rather difficult. However, the differences between their edition and the manuscript Matanadaran 789, I want to thank the Matanadaran Institute that has kindly provided me with the digital copies of the corresponding folios from this manuscript. The difference between this text and this published text are relatively few. And what is interesting, the Mehiterists edition contains a number of grammatical errors, and the syntax is not very clear either, while the manuscript version of the same text sometimes provides clearer readings. In any case, the relation between this edition and the existing manuscript versions will require further investigation. So I think there might be more manuscripts that need to be checked. And now I will turn to the main features of the Armenian tradition of the man of God. His memory is celebrated on the 17th of March, the 9th of Areg. And this is the date that we get from the Haismavurk, the edition of Ter Israel Haismavurk, Synaxarium, contains the same date. There are two versions of this legend, of this story. The first one is the one published by the Mehiterists, and this is the one that we would call anonymous, man of God, because it does not provide the saint's name. And then there is another version, the one contained in the Synaxaric versions, Haismavurk, Menologia, in which the saint receives a name Alexianos, which is very, again, interesting because he is never Alexianos or Alexianus in any other versions. He's always Alexios in the Greek or Alexius in the Latin version. And here we come to the name mystery of the Armenian version. The Armenian text refers to the saint as Kamavor Ahkat, the voluntary pauper. It also calls him the son of the kings of Rome, or the king of Rome, Vortita Gavorin or Vortita Gavorat. But the most used frequent name it applies to him is just Yeraneli, the Blessed One. Somewhere in the middle of the text of the longer version, of the anonymous version, he suddenly receives the name Air Astuats, or Air Astutso, or Air Tian, the man of God, the man of the Lord, but it does not receive any explanation. But the most interesting bit is that the Armenian tradition is the only one that actually uses the word anonymous. In the rubric of the Matanadaran 789, it actually says that this is the Patmutyon Yervark of the anonymous Ananun Vortvota Gavorin Hromots. So this is not a missing name, it's really the emphasis that is made on his anonymity. In the Ananun anonymous version, there are no names apart from the name of the bishop of Edessa, Rabua. Even the parents remain anonymous, which would be very strange if the text would be based on the later Syriac version that has the names, or on the Greek version. Most of the scholars that studied the tradition usually just say, in a very general way, that the man of God in the Armenian tradition is just following the Greek version. However, this is not true. The Armenian version has a number of special features that really set this text apart from the Greek version and also from the Syriac. One of them is the great number of details, more than in the Syriac version, more than in the Greek version. Another feature is the absence of any personal name. The saints' parents remain the king and the queen. There are many dialogues between the characters, which might be just a result of heavy editing, or maybe it's the trace of a pre-existing tradition. Also, the style feels very heavy, but that might be just a problem of translation or that particular editor or author. And also a particular emphasis on self-humiliation and poverty and anonymity. And secondly, some episodes in the Armenian version do not correspond to the Syriac legend or the Greek version. The lengthy description of the wedding garments of a saint is not found anywhere. His very special belt, and the author dedicates a whole paragraph to the description of this beautiful belt. It ends up in the hands of the ship owners, not of the bride, as it was in the Greek story. Also, the Ananun version, this longer version, contains a very special episode which does not appear in any other version, and that is a dialogue between the priest, Kahana, and the saint in Edessa, in which the Saint Ananun insists on remaining anonymous because his name, as he says, is not worthy of any commemoration. And this particular emphasis on anonymity is something we encounter in the Syriac ascetic tradition. It is very interesting that the editor or the author of the Armenian version decided to elaborate this point, this tradition. And so I think I might draw some preliminary conclusions on the duality of the man of God in the Armenian tradition. I think that we might rather safely say that the longer Ananun anonymous version reflects the old Syriac layer of legend, anonymity of the saint and other characters being the most convincing factor. And the Synaxaric Alexianos versions must be based on the Greek version. So if this hypothesis is correct, then we might have a very important witness to the earliest Syriac legend, and the next step will be to look into that direction. Thank you for your attention.